Hi, Michael.
Okay, hi. Now I have the volume on.
Hi, yes. So it looks like our attendee list, the number is still clicking up, so I think the connections are still getting established. So once the number stabilizes in a minute or so, I'll give the introduction and start you off.
Oh, already. I thought it was beginning at 12:30.
Nope, 12:15.
Oh, I thought that was just for the sign-in. Okay.
Glad you're here.
Well, I was reading the New York Times and I got a sneezing fit from the newsprint. And I had
All right. It looks like our number has stabilized, so I think people who were getting their connections established are now in. So hi, everybody. The first couple of sessions that I went to, one of the things I found a little odd is not knowing who else is here. So I'll tell you that it actually just clicked again. We have about 54 people here, so we can think of this as a fairly crowded room. Welcome, everybody, to the 23rd annual David Gordon Memorial Lecture. Little bit of introduction and then we'll turn it over to Michael. David Gordon, who lived from 1944 to 1996, was professor of economics at the New School for Social Research and director of the Center for Economic Policy Analysis. His contributions focused mainly on poverty, discrimination, segmented labor markets, and long-run capitalist development. In memory and honor of David Gordon, the first David Gordon Memorial Lecture was given in 1998 at the Union for Radical Political Economics Summer Conference, and it is now presented annually at the Allied Social Science Association meetings by an economist invited by the Review of Radical Political Economics editorial board, whose work follows in the tradition of Gordon's contributions. Many of the past lectures can be read in past issues of the journal. This year's lecture will be given by Michael Hudson, who will speak on finance capitalism versus industrial capitalism, the rentier resurgence and takeover, and his talk will be followed by discussant comments from Josh Mason and discussion with all of you. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Michael Hudson is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, a Wall Street financial analyst, distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and author of numerous books and articles on neoliberalism, finance, taxation, economic history, and much more. So thank you for being here, Michael, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I wish you were there in person because I love Chicago, which is where I grew up. And I'm also glad that this is connected with David Gordon, because after I left the New School in 1972, Anwar Sheikh took over my international trade theory course, and the next year, David Gordon took over my money and banking course and my macroeconomics courses. I'd been using Marx's theories of surplus value as the basic text for my national income course. The first translation was in 1952 in English, and Russia didn't publish an English translation for many other years, but I was using the American translation. And this led to a lot of antagonism, both from a professor who claimed to be a Marxist, who said that Marxism was all about the exploitation of labor by employers extracting surplus value, which of course is right. That was Marx's basic contribution, and it's the essence of volume 1 of Capital. But Marx also analyzed the survivals of European feudalism, land rent and banking and finance. And he did that in volumes 2 and 3. So, and it may seem ironic that Marxists, despite the fact that, of course, they focus on labor-capital relations, of course, all of their emphasis is on the laws of motion of industrial capitalism, but the Marxists have taken the lead in analyzing rent theory and financial theory. David Harvey for rent and interest in volume 3, Radical Desai up in Canada, and of course, Hyman Minsky for modern monetary theory was a Marxist, treating finance as a public utility. Well, one of the reasons that I left the New School was Bob Haugrunner, who was department chairman, said that the most worthless discussion in economics was attempts to distinguish between productive and unproductive labor and investment. But that was the key to classical economics, the key to value theory, price theory, and rent, to decide what is socially necessary cost of production, which is ultimately reducible to labor, and what is what Marx called the false production, the rentier sectors, economic rent, monopoly rent, land rent, and financial usury. This got Heilbronner in a fury. He said he was a Marxist and he defended banks and he defended the large monopolies. So I realized that academia was not really for me, and went back essentially to consulting for governments. But what's important is ever since there's been a kind of hostility almost in many parts of the radical movement against analyzing finance, and not a hostility, but just a looking over as a treatment as if it's irrelevant, as if it's extra, and the real fight is between labor and capital. Well, of course, that is the real fight between within industrial capitalism. And Marx certainly made fun of the idealists after the 1848 revolutions, when he said, look, the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and all of the French land taxers, Cherbulier, did indeed want to lower the cost of production. The essence of industrial capitalism was to lower the cost of production so that you industrialists in one country could undersell those of another country. And Marx said that after trying to get rid of the landlord rent, after repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846 to prevent agricultural protectionism of Britain's landlords, to lower their rents in order to buy cheap food to fund labor, Marx criticized the branch of classical economics that simply became an anti-labor fight. It's one thing, Marx said, to lower the cost of living so that you can lower the minimum wage by having the government take over more and more social services and infrastructure. It's another to have the actual fight against labor by capitalists. Now, it's one thing to free industrial capitalism from the remnants of feudalism, from land rent, from monopoly rent, for banking, but it's another to fight within the industrial capitalist system against labor. So that there are many ways of exploiting labor, and Marx's great contribution was to show that there are numerous ways by which labor is exploited. So the reason that I used his Theories of Surplus Value is my macroeconomics textbook was that he really described two economic systems. On the one hand was the system we're all familiar with, the industrial capitalist sector of production and consumption, and as he put it, its laws of motion. The wage labor, the payments to the wage labor, the spending of wages on what labor produced, and because labor couldn't buy everything that it produced, the spending by the capitalists on capital goods and equipment to continue to expand the whole industrial capitalist system. On the other hand, Marx, more than anyone else of his generation, described the financial sector and the rent extraction sector. This is what the classical economics from Adam Smith and Ricardo and the others had begun to describe. And what Marx said is that the laws of motion for the financial sector are not only very different from those of industrial capitalism, but they have no grounding at all in the industrial economy. That, as he put it in volume 3, the laws of motion for the growth of debt in an economy are purely mathematical. And it's the mathematics of compound interest, that every debt can be looked at as a doubling time, the time that it takes a debt to double. And Marx pointed out that the tendency of finance of the debt overhead was to grow faster than the actual industrial capitalist economy. And that was why business cycles occurred. And Marx did not think of business cycles. He thought, of, as everyone else of his time, of business crashes. There was a slow upswing and then a crash, a slow upswing and then a financial crash, because the volume of debt tended to exceed the ability of the economy to pay. This was a periodicity that he traced between 11 and 13 years. And he really became the first business cycle theorists, finding that the cycle or the crash, the periodicity, was a function of the tensions between the industrial core of industrial capitalism and the overhead, the finance, insurance, real estate, the rentier overhead that was really inherited from the feudal epoch. And Marx followed the rest of classical British political economy and expecting that the destiny of industrial capitalism was going to free economies from this rentier overhead. The whole fight of British reform, from the physiocrats to Adam Smith, through John Stuart Mill and the Ricardian socialists, was to say, our economy as an industrial economy in Britain cannot compete if we have to support the idle landlord class on our shoulders. And the landlord class extracts income. It's not productive income. It's purely extractive, or what today would be called a transfer payment. And that adds to the cost of doing business. And capitalism competes both with among capitalists themselves in a given economy, but also with internationally with other economies by creating a society that frees itself from the remnants of feudalism, that minimizes land rent. And that was, in fact, the first item in the Communist Manifesto, was to take land rent into the public domain. You nationalize the land. Other people wanted simply to tax the land. And also to industrialize banking. This was not unrealistic in Marx's time. While he was writing, Germany was actually developing an industrial banking with a kind of three-way cooperation between banks, the government, the Reichsbank, and large industry. And banking in Central Europe, unlike England and America and the English-speaking countries, in Central European banking was actually to finance capital investment in new means of production, largely using a military excuse for this: naval building, the steel industry, the chemical industry, and all of this. And in that sense, Marx described capitalism itself as being revolutionary. And it was revolutionary in fighting against the whole class structure that was inherited from feudalism. And that's why he defined industrial capitalism as a different mode of production from feudalism. It wasn't to extract income through peonage, debt, serfdom, and through interest, but through the capitalists' accumulation of profits. And in the capitalists' search for profits, the capitalists would fight against the landlord class and against the old banking class, and transform, it would industrialize banking. And in the process, Marx said, industrial capitalism was going to pave the way for socialism, for government taking over of the means of production, starting with public infrastructure. And in fact, that was happening at his time, and it was happening most of all in Britain and the United States. The destiny was to prepare the lead towards socialism by socializing education, healthcare, transportation, and communications. And that was led by advocates of industrial capitalism. not by working class socialists as part of a class war, but it was the conservative Prime Minister of Britain, Benjamin Disraeli, that said, health. Health is all. We have to have a public health system in order to basically lower the cost of production. Disraeli followed that up with an Education Act to provide cheap education. The whole idea was for government to bear the basic public infrastructure that otherwise would be monopolized. The post office, the communication system, the transportation system. All of this basic infrastructure was developed in the public domain. And in the United States, the first business professor at the first business school, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Simon Patton, said that government infrastructure in communications, transportation, the Erie Canal, the railroads, was a fourth factor of production alongside labor, capital, and land. But unlike industrial capital, a government investment was not aimed at making a profit. It was aimed at providing services that were essential for the economy to operate at a low price to minimize the cost of transportation, minimize the cost of education, so that capitalists would not have to pay their workers wage that would cover operations that are monopolized in today's economy. In other words, this is the opposite of Thatcherism and Reaganism, which goes against the entire industrial strategy of Marx's day and indeed of the 19th century. So Marx believed that all of this public investment in basic infrastructure was going to transform banking, transform land. In the past in Europe, nations had run into debt, largely war debts, and when they couldn't pay the debts, the financial bondholders and the bankers had insisted in governments creating monopolies. And the monopolies could take the form of toll roads, of the East and West India Company, and of banking. The Bank of England was created in exchange for 1.2 million pounds that Britain needed to pay the war debts that it had just run into in the early 18th century, which then saw the South Sea Company, that was another kind of monopoly that was socialized. Marx saw quite accurately that if these monopolies were privatized and left in the private domain, they would extract monopoly rents, and monopoly rents would increase the cost of doing business, not only for the laborers, the wage earners, but also for the employers, for the whole economy, and that if you did not get rid of this post-feudal superstructure, then your economy would not be able to compete. So Marx thought that the basic working of markets, indeed a free market, would be that the rentiers would be taken over essentially by the government. What used to be done for private monopoly rents and for profits, absentee landlordism, monopolies, and especially banking, would be socialized, and the government would not have to tax industry, would not have to tax labor. It would, what the revenue that the governments would get would be the economic rent, the land rent, monopoly rent, and financial interest and fees that in the past had been privatized. Well, this seemed to be what was going to happen right down until World War I. In 1909 and 10, England finally passed a land tax by Parliament. The House of Lords refused to go along with it. And as a result, there was a constitutional crisis. The House of Lords was never again permitted to actually overrule a revenue act of Parliament. And not only Marx, but almost every historian and politician of the late 19th century saw industrial capitalism as promoting democracy. And the reason was quite simple. Democracy meant the lower house of government, the elected house of government, Parliament in England, its counterparts in the continental Europe, and the House of Representatives in the United States, gaining power over the House of Lords, or the upper houses controlled by the landlord class and the rentier class in Europe, and the Senate in the United States. And the reason that industrial capitalism was backing the move towards democracy and parliamentary reform in England, France, Germany, was because they needed the support of democracy to counteract the main opponent of progress, the main opponent of industrial capitalism, which was the landlord class and the banking class. Well, as it turned out, we all know that Marx was overly optimistic in this, and so was everybody in the late 19th century. Almost everyone, if you read the tracts and the economics publications of the late 19th century, from Europe to America, they all saw the future of industrial capitalism as being socialism. But there were many kinds of socialism. There was Ricardian socialism, which was basically tax away the land and or nationalize the land, and then you won't have a landlord class, and we'll stop there. There was Christian socialism, whatever that was. It was not liberation theology. It was sort of just a vague communalism. There was libertarian socialism of Henry George and the very anti-socialist proto-Ayn Rand movements that ultimately became fascism, libertarianism in the United States. And of course, there was Marxian socialism, which was the only kind of socialism that actually survived all of this turmoil, but it survived because the rest of the economy, the industrial economies, succumbed. The rentiers fought back. And instead of banking being industrialized, industry's been financialized. Instead of land rent being taxed away and nationalized, you have the real estate sector being untaxed. So that if you look at the national income statistics in the United States, from 1945 to present, last 75 years, the real estate industry hasn't paid any income tax at all in the nation, because it has special gimmicks to free itself. For one thing, it pretends that buildings and real estate is losing its value by a fictitious depreciation allowance. Donald Trump said that what he loves most of all is the depreciation allowance, because it means he doesn't have to pay tax. And the other reason that landlords don't have to pay tax is because they can deduct the interest charges from rent. So what you have today, not only for commercial developers like Donald Trump and real estate owners, but also for homeowners. It turned out that, yes, there's no more landlord class in the United States or Europe. Land has been democratized. In Europe, the home ownership rate is about 80%. In America, it fell from 69% down to 61% after Obama's evictions took place. But basically, it was democratized on credit. And in order to buy a home or to buy a building, if you're an investor, you borrow the money. And you pay the rent. The winning bid is the bid that is willing to pay the rental income to the banks as interest. And what the commercial investor is over and what the homeowner is after is the capital gain. Land is going up in price. And the reason that land is going up in price represents the largest part of American wealth and property is because it's been untaxed. This is the exact opposite of everything that the classical economists advocated. They wanted the land tax and other monopoly taxes to be the whole source of government income. And in 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created in the United States, the income tax was also created. When it was created, only 1% of Americans had to pay income tax. And they were mainly the rentiers. They were the monopolists, the big landed interests, the big capitalists. Labor and small business did not even have to file. Well, very soon after that, you had the rentiers fight back. You had the most profitable industry, the oil industry, having the equivalent of fictitious depreciation. They had the depletion allowance that pretended that the oil was being depleted, and that made them tax-free in exchange, in addition to the fact that they created offshore flags of convenience to avoid paying any income tax. So here you have the two major rentier sectors in the United States, oil along with mining and real estate, being basically exempt from the income tax. Who has to pay the income tax? The employees, basically, they've shifted onto labor and industry. This is one reason that America is de-industrializing. So basically, what you're having today is rent deflation and debt deflation of the overall economy. And the result is that where Marxists have focused on labor's exploitation by industrial capital through wage labor, and that's the kind of exploitation that Marx found was unique to industrial capitalism. You have other forms of exploitation today, and these are the forms of exploitation that I think the left has not paid anywhere near as much attention to, although Marx certainly did. The obvious forms of exploitation financial is labor is indebted. It has to pay credit card debt. It has to pay either mortgage debt if it buys a home for 2/3 of the population in America, or else if it rents, it has to pay a rent high enough to carry the mortgage debt of the landlord. And also labor has to pay for the medical costs here. As you know, the medical insurance is 18% of America's GDP. These are the costs that the conservative Benjamin Disraeli said should be public. They're the costs that are public in Europe. All this has made America a very high-cost economy. And an indirect way of exploiting labor through the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate together, is what Alan Greenspan called the traumatized worker syndrome. That workers owe so much money now to the banks, for the mortgage, for their credit cards, for their automobile debt, for their personal loan debt, that if they protest against their job conditions or go on strike, then they'll miss a payment. And if they miss a payment on their monthly bill, their interest rate goes up from about 11% to 29%. And they're in real trouble. Well, of course, that's happened to more and more workers in today's pandemic. So that the result is that America is de-industrializing, and it's de-industrializing not because of the dynamics of finance capitalism that Marx described, but because the capitalist system, the industrial capitalism, failed in what Marx said was its historic destiny to free itself from the rentier classes, to free itself from high housing costs by having to pay land rent or payment to the banks, to free itself from high financial costs by usury banking. Banks in America and England do not make loans at all to fund capital investment in new means of production. Banks only make loans based on collateral. They'll make a loan against a building in place, and they'll make a loan to a corporate raider against a company that already exists with its factories and means of production. The raider will try to take it over. The first thing he'll try to do is to loot the pension fund. Or to threaten to close down the factory if the labor union doesn't agree to shift from a defined benefit program where you know what you're going to get to a defined contribution program, which all you know is what's coming in and not what's going to go out. So you have essentially a finance capitalism that has replaced industrial capitalism, as if this is somehow progress, as if this is a wave to the future, but actually it's a retrogression back towards the feudal mode of production, back towards a hereditary rentier class. In this case, the fire sector rentiers and absentee land ownership, monopolists, and banks is the coordinator as the mother of trusts. So what you have now is a completely different set of laws of motion from today's finance capitalist economy than those that Marx outlined for the industrial economy. The whole essence of classical economics that Marx accepted as the last great classical economist was that the idea of a free market was a market free from the false costs of production, free from economic rent, free from landlords, and free from banking. That was to minimize costs, and that seemed to be the natural form of competition among international capitalists. But finance capitalism is the opposite. It wants to free economies from government taxation, from regulation against monopolies, and from any kind of moves against rent-producing assets. It's a free market today, and what you're taught in all the universities is free for the rentiers to do whatever they want. Free for rentiers to add to the economy's costs of production. So the laws of motion increase the cost of production in the United States. That's why we're de-industrializing. Nobody has said that this is decapitalizing, but it is decapitalizing. You could say decapitating the American economy. Well, the ideal of industrial capitalism was either to tax away land or nationalize it, which is the only real way to take away the land rent. That was what the progressive income tax was intended to do. But finance capitalism is to give tax favoritism to the real estate sector, as I mentioned, no income tax since 1945, and to have regressive taxation today. The more you earn, the lower the tax rate. Same for finance is essentially tax exempt by the so-called carried interest pretense of that it's all like a kind of a rent that only is taxed at 15%, not at the regular income tax rate. And capital gains are not taxed at all in real estate. They're not taxed at all. If you sell the real estate for a capital gain and you buy more real estate, you're not taxed. If you continue the process and then you die upon death, you're not taxed. If you're a corporation, and a monopolist such as Apple or Amazon, you relocate to Ireland, or you pretend to take all of your profits in a low tax country, just like the oil industry takes its profits in Panama or Liberia that don't have any income tax. They were the first offshore banking centers. Well, now you have the whole capitalist class taking its income in offshore banking centers. So the whole idea of finance capitalism is to untax wealth and shift the tax burden onto labor. Well, of course, this makes it more expensive to hire labor here. As I've often pointed out in my lectures, if you gave American labor all of their goods and services for nothing, all of their food, their clothing, transportation free, they still couldn't compete with foreign labor because of the heavy tax costs, the debt overhead that they have to pay, the 15% Social Security costs for socialized medicine, the corporate medical care programs. America has priced itself out of the market by preventing the dynamic of industrial capitalism that Marx described in the 3 volumes of Capital and elaborated in his posthumous theories of surplus value. Well, the same thing, the result is that the whole essence of industrial capitalism to Marx was to make profits or surplus value which is his adjustment of profits for the various ratios of capital to labor. That's not the aim of finance capitalism. The aim of finance capitalism is to make no profits at all. Just like the famous hotelier, Leona Helmsley, said, only the poor people pay taxes. Finance capital could say, only the poor people make profits. The small businessmen make profits. But the dynamic of finance capitalism is to make capital gains. It's all to increase the asset prices of real estate, of stocks, and bonds. And in fact, if you look at what's happened since the Obama depression began in 2009, all of the growth of GDP in America from 2009 to today has accrued to only 5% of the population. Pavlina Chernova at the Bard Institute, Levy Institute, has produced a wonderful chart for that. For 95% of the American population, GDP has shrunk. And if you look at, you break down the GDP, you find one of the things that finance capitalism has done that distinguishes itself from industrial capitalism is it's taken over the brains of the economy. It's centralized planning from government to Wall Street. Libertarianism, free markets is a doctrine of centralized planning, but the centralization of planning is shifted from Washington, from elected representatives to the central banks, to Wall Street. That also goes back to 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was created and shifted financial planning from the Treasury in Washington to New York, with even excluding the Treasury Secretary from the board. So you have the whole idea of academic economics and statistics seeming to show that there's economic growth of GDP under finance capitalism. But if you look at this, what is this? 8% is homeowners' imputed rent. In other words, the increase in rental value that homeowners would have to pay themselves if they rented to themselves instead of owning. The other great element of GDP growth is interest, and much more the penalty fees. Credit card companies make more money in penalties and fees than they do from interest. And this is counted in the GDP accounts as providing financial services. The financial service is simply charging a penalty. So when labor becomes more insolvent, falls behind, misses a payment, GDP goes up. So what you have is sort of a travesty. You have what the classical economists considered economic overhead now to be considered not parasitism, but actual production. What a landlord made in his sleep, as John Stuart Mill said, that's considered land rent is part of GDP. So all of this overhead that industrial capitalism was supposed to free itself from has all been transformed. Money creation has been, and productive was supposed to take the form of productive bank lending to increase capital investment, but that's not what finance capitalism does. And in fact, finance capitalism today, the right-wing monetarists, especially from the University of Chicago, the Republican Party, and most of all now Biden and the Democratic Party want balanced budgets. Biden just said last week, we have to increase the military budget, we have to balance the budget, we have to cut back social spending. Labor has to pay for the increased military threat from China. In other words, threat from a country that is following, in a way, everything that Marx described as the basic dynamic of industrial capitalism. In China, it has free education, not higher education, and not student debt, as in the United States. They have very low-priced transportation. They have low-priced services. China is doing exactly what the United States did to subsidize its industrial capitalism in the late 19th century. you can call this Marxism, you can call it industrial capitalism, you can call it state capitalism. It's all the same. It's the inherent logic of industrial engineering for economic growth. Well, what finance capitalism has instead is financial engineering. And financial engineering is based on debt pyramiding, of essentially debt leveraging, borrowing at a low interest rate to buy a much higher yielding stocks or bonds. So I'm going to have to, I've reached the end of my limit. So my point is that there are two economies, and Marx described the production and consumption core of industrial capitalism, but that industrial capitalism is wrapped in the context of property and asset and debts and finance capitalism and the fire sector. Bourgeois economics supports finance capitalism, not classical economics. And it's been able to do this by stripping away the history of economic thought from the curriculum. When I went to school in the 1960s, at least they still taught the history of economic thought. But now that's all been dropped. And the idea is that only by excluding the history of classical thought from the curriculum can you make it appear as if Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and all the classical economists were really free market pro-financial economists, which is a travesty of what it was. And of course, the real reason that classical economic thought is opposed is because it all culminated in Marxism. Marx pointed it, made it essentially the logical conclusion of Smith and Ricardo and everything was his system. That's why if you're analyzing today the CARES Act of Donald Trump, you had all of the CARES, 8 trillion of the CARES Act went to support prices for stocks and bonds and real estate debt, essentially for capital gains. The economy shrunk last year. The stock market went to a new high. That is not industrial capitalism. That is finance capitalism. So the question is, when one criticizes capitalism, what are you criticizing? Are you, most people really are criticizing the failure of capitalism to free itself from feudalism. And what we're having is a neo-feudalism masquerading as capitalism. And it's a restoration of a medieval type of rentier economy. So essentially, that's the essence of what I think economics should be all about. And it means that if you're a Marxist and a critique of capitalism, you have to create a new set of economic statistics based on the classical concepts of productive versus unproductive labor. What is a product and what is merely an economic rent, a transfer payment, an economic overhead?
Thank you, Michael. So the next step, we have discussant comments from Josh Mason, and then we'll have Josh and Michael discuss a little bit between themselves while all of you can put your questions into the Q&A. So first Josh, then we'll start collecting your questions as Josh and Michael react to each other. So Josh, you can go ahead.
So this paper is built around an overarching opposition between industrial capitalism and financial capitalism. One way of thinking about that opposition is that if you are someone in search of higher profits, there are two broad approaches you can take. One is to transform some production process that you're in control of in a way that lets you produce the same commodities at a lower cost. The other is to use whatever market or political power you have to get people to pay you a higher price for the same commodities, or better yet, simply compel them to pay you, full stop. The first of these approaches, lowering costs, is supposed to dominate in industry, while the second dominates in real estate, finance, and extractive industries. So financialization then describes a shift away from cost reduction and towards this sort of rent-seeking activity as the main form in which profits are pursued. Now, one implication of this is that capitalists competing on the basis of cost have a strong interest in cheaper labor power. This implies, among other things, that they may support public measures to meet the subsistence needs of labor, for instance, through public education, healthcare, and so on, since those needs then no longer have to be met out of wages. Both the pressure to lower costs by improving productivity and the support for socializing the costs of reproduction of labor give industrial capitalists or industrial capitalism a progressive character which financial capitalism lacks. Finally, the paper suggests that we can see these two modes of profit seeking as following a historical sequence, that at one point in the past, we had industrial capitalism, while today we have financial capitalism, although the timing of this shift is a little bit unclear to me. All right, so I think this is a useful framework, which I hope I've briefly summarized in a way that's not too far from something that Michael would accept. But I do want to push back on a couple of points in particular. First, I'm not as convinced that finance and industry can be thought of as distinct social actors as opposed to distinct moments in a single process. Second, I am not convinced that the historical evolution of these different forms of profit seeking can be usefully understood through the kind of before and after dichotomy that the paper is framed around. And finally, I have some concerns about the kind of political project that the analysis points to. So let's start with the idea that industrial capitalists support public investments in areas like education, healthcare, transportation, because they lower the reproduction costs of labor. This, of course, would be less important for the owners of land or financial assets or natural resources because their claim on the social surplus does not mainly come through employing labor. I would not say this argument is wrong, but I am quite struck in the paper of the lack of discussion of the other ways in which industrial capitalists can reduce the costs of labor, by lowering the subsistence level of workers, by reducing the bargaining power of workers, by extracting more effort, or by shifting employment to lower wage regions or populations. The idea that the normal or usual effect of efforts to reduce the cost of labor is the pursuit of socializing the reproduction cost of labor seems optimistic to me. We also need to be clear, public spending on social reproduction only reduces costs for the capitalist class if we assume that the real subsistence level is fixed. As soon as we allow for the possibility that there's some degree of conflict or bargaining over workers' share in the total social product, it's possible that socializing reproduction costs, for instance, by providing public healthcare, does not lower the cost for capitalists, but simply raises the standard of living of workers. In fact, that's why many of us support those sorts of measures. Now, on the flip side of this, I think that the argument that landlords are not a force for capitalist progress is not as strong as the paper suggests. Ellen Meekson's Wood famously argues that the origins of what we call industrial capitalism should really be placed in the countryside in the period before what we normally think of as the Industrial Revolution, where competition among tenants spurred productivity boosting improvements in agricultural land. So here it's actually the seeking of agricultural rent by commercial landlords that is a big driver of technological progress and cost reduction. Similarly, the economic historian Gavin Wright argues that one of the key reasons for greater public investment in the antebellum North relative to the South was precisely the fact that so much of the wealth of the North took the form of urban land. Land speculators had a strong interest in promoting canals, roads, and other forms of public investment because they could expect capital gains, asset price appreciation in the areas in which that investment took place. Here in New York City, where I'm located, the first subways were built by a company controlled by August Belmont, who was also a major land speculator. In a number of cases, Belmont, along with the builders of the competing BMT system a bit later, would extend transit service into areas where they or their partners had assembled large land holdings to be able to develop or sell off the land at a premium after transit made it more valuable. The possibility of these capital gains was a big factor in spurring private and later public investment in transit service early in the 20th century. None of this is to defend landlords, but it is to make the point that the private capture of the gains from the development of forces of production is under capitalism the condition for that development occurring in the first place. When I think of an industrial capitalist, I think perhaps of Henry Frick, the author of The Massacre of Striking Workers at Homestead. If we can acknowledge a role for someone like that in the development of society's productive forces, I think we also need to acknowledge the role of swindlers like August Belmont. More broadly, it seems to me that the two modes of profit seeking that Hudson identifies with industrial and financial capitalism are not as distinct as they might appear at first glance. It might seem that profiting from a new, more efficient production process is very different from profiting by getting some legal monopoly or compelling people to simply pay you money. It's true that improvements in production generate real gains for society, while rent collection does not. But how do the gains from productive improvements come to be claimed as profit by the capitalist? First, the capitalists must have exclusive access to the means of production so that they can claim the gains to the exclusion of the workers and everyone else involved in that production process. Second, the capitalist must enjoy some degree of market power in selling those products to allow them to capture the gains rather than the consumers of the product. So the existence of some type of rent, of some type of market power is actually integral to the development of industrial capitalism. It's not a specific feature of this sort of parasitic financial capitalism. Michael uses the terms rentier and monopolist as if they were equivalent, but I really don't think they are. There are plenty of people who enjoy monopoly power in production, and in fact, in the development of industrial capitalism, the ability to exercise some type of monopoly power so as to capture the gains from your investment was essential. Now, Michael, I think, is well aware of all of these points that I'm making, and he mentions in the paper that, you know, Marx said that in some sense the capitalist himself is simply another rent collector, another passive rentier. But I think if we follow this thought further, we will find it creates problems for the larger dichotomy the paper is arguing for. Capital is a process, it's a circuit. It's value and emotion from money to commodities through a production process to new commodities and a return to money. That's what capital is. Now, we usually think of this circuit as taking place at the level of an individual commodity, but it applies at larger scales too. We can think of the growth of an industrial firm as a circuit in which value is first embodied in the form of concrete means of production, including the social means of production, the coordination embodied in the structure of the firm itself. And then the payouts to shareholders or other financial claimants represent the return of that money to the form, the return of that value to the money form. The return of value to the money form is just as essential to the circuit of capital as production is. It is true, as Michael notes in the paper, that payouts to shareholders absorb a very large fraction of profits generated by industrial firms, much larger than any contribution you might see the shareholders is putting in. You could say from this, finance is just a parasite on the industrial production, but you could also simply say those shareholder payouts are where the M moment of the circuit is taking place. The financial engineers who move profits out of the firm are just as much a part of the circuit of industrial capital as the engineers who optimize the production process. My other larger concern with this paper is the historical dimension of it. The sense one gets from reading this paper, I should say that the talk here was in my mind a little more complex than this, but certainly the sense one gets from the paper is that there's a before and after. We had industrial capitalism, now we have financial capitalism. I'm not sure that history really works like that. It's true, obviously, that there have been historical changes in the form in which surplus is realized as money, and there have been changes in what kinds of human beings institutions embodied capital at various points in its circuit. So we've moved certainly from a world in which we have smaller businesses where the same individual enjoys legal title to the business, manages the production process, and directly receives the income from the business, to another type of corporation that obviously dominates today, where the production process is handled by professional managers, while the profit income is received by some type of shareholder or other financial claimant who is a separate person or a separate individual. And this separation of ownership from control creates the possibility of a contradiction between the conditions of generating surplus and realizing it, which can appear as a conflict between distinct social actors. This shift of most large enterprises to publicly traded corporations took place in the US in a relatively short period starting in the 1890s. The timing is going to be different elsewhere, but the separation of ownership and control is a fairly universal phenomenon, which was perceived at the time as a momentous change. I think if we are looking for a break between these two forms of capitalism, that would probably be the period to locate it. Certainly already by the early 20th century, we can find observers like Thorsten Veblen describing the, quote, sabotage of productive enterprises by finance in terms that in some ways are very reminiscent to the ones that Michael uses here. So I think we could reasonably describe that process as one of financialization, but I think it's important to realize it's not a one-way trip, and it's not one that happens uniformly across the board. So a little later, 1930s, Keynes famously described American capital development as the byproduct of casino, again, in terms somewhat similar to the ones Michael is using. But the interesting thing is if we look at that moment, the trend was actually in the other direction. The influence of financial markets over the actual operation of production was diminishing in the mid-20th century and reached a low point a few decades later in the mid-20th century. So what we see, I think, historically is much more, if we're looking at the influence of financial markets over production, we see much more of a back and forth, a push and pull than sort of a once and for all shift. We also can see historically that moves in one direction in one place can coexist with or even reinforce moves in the other direction somewhere else. Michael talks about the repeal of the Corn Laws and how this sort of broke the power of the landlord class in England. But of course, by the same token, the specialization of England in industry implied a greater specialization towards primary production elsewhere in the world and a reinforcement of the power of the landlords elsewhere in the world. One thing that we can certainly learn from the new historians of capitalism like Sven Beckert is how much the development of industry in Britain, in the north of the US, and in other places went hand in hand with the development of the power of landowners, slave owners, and other sorts of neo-feudalism elsewhere in the world. It wasn't simply one or the other, but the two of them, in some cases, growing up together in mutually reinforcing ways. Now, moving towards the present, we know that the influence of financial claimants over production has certainly been reasserted aggressively in the period, let's say, since 1980, the shareholder revolution and so on. This is a real historical phenomenon, somewhat specific to the US, but also, observable in other countries to different degrees. I don't think, however, that one can go from this to a claim that today's leading capitalists are equivalent of feudal landowners, as Michael suggests in the paper and to some extent in his talk here. For instance, one of the central developments in finance over the past generation is the development of venture capital and private equity. Now, both of these can be seen in a way as a kind of definancialization, because their role is to unify ownership and control. Their role is to not have the profits of a firm flow out to a widely dispersed set of passive rentiers, but to allow them to be captured by the actual individuals or entities that are directing the production of that process in that firm itself. Now, the fact that, for instance, the development of new industries in Silicon Valley has required the development of this new form of finance, I think is consistent with Michael's vision that sort of the conventional institutions of finance are not well suited to fostering the development of the force of production. But it is not consistent with a notion that we simply have seen sort of a one-way shift towards passive rentiers. Michael talks about the current mode of exploitation as resembling debt peonage or feudalism. But I really don't think that's right. A creditor or a landlord stand outside the production process. The debt peon has, or the sharecropper or the peasant, they have direct access to the means of production. They control their own production process, and then at the end they hand over some part of the product to the creditor. Similarly, or if it's a feudal landlord. Capitalists today do not operate like that. Their authority and their claim on the surplus, just as it was in Marx's day, is based fundamentally on their control over the production process. And the transformation of that production process is still the source of the biggest capital incomes today. Again, just as much, I think, as it was in Marx's day. If you look, for instance, at the Forbes 400 list of the richest Americans, what you'll be struck by is how rare generalized financial wealth is on that list. There are very few simply owners of financial assets on that list. What you'll find instead is people with claims on particular firms that they have a direct relationship to. Of the top 20 names on that list, I just looked before this, on the top 20 names, all but one of them are either founders of companies that they have actively managed or the immediate family members of those founders, children, or in one case, a divorced wife. The one exception, incidentally, is Warren Buffett. He's the only sort of rentier on that list. Now, whatever you say about Jeff Bezos, and I'd be happy to say some very unpleasant things about him, but he is not an idle rentier. He is not a feudal landlord. He is not a hereditary aristocrat, and he's not a recipient of transfers. His wealth comes from the transformation of production in a way that does reduce social costs. Companies like Walmart or Google or Amazon are excellent examples of industrial capitalism in the sense that Michael is describing. They sell products, they lower prices, they generate profits, not just capital gains, and they put strong downward pressure on costs. Does this mean that Amazon and Walmart are good? No, they're quite bad for society in many ways. Although we should also acknowledge that just as industrial capitalists who ordered massacres of striking workers also contributed to the development of the force of production, so the logistical systems developed by a company like Walmart are genuine technological accomplishments that a socialist society could build on. But my real point is simply that the greatest concentrations of wealth today come from the competition to sell more desirable goods at lower prices. I don't look at the world today and see the commanding heights of capitalist wealth and power are occupied by rentiers or passive rent extractors. Finally, the political implications of this analysis. If we take Michael's story seriously, we may see a political divide between industrial capital and finance capital, where popular movements might potentially seek an alliance with the former. I'm very skeptical about this. I should say, and there's a story, and I wish I could find the source of it. I heard this years ago about healthcare reform during during the Clinton administration, so the previous attempt at this, and the heads of the various big auto manufacturers being approached to see if they would support healthcare reform on this exactly the grounds Michael suggests, that this would be shifting their costs from their wage bill to the general public. And the response apparently was, well, that would be okay, but our real priority right now is estate tax reform. So if you can get the estate tax brought down, then maybe we can work out a deal. So for these industrial capitalists, their self-identification was as rentiers and as owners of wealth that they would like to leave on, and not with reducing costs. But in any case, I think more generally, I just don't see this as a politically productive project. Michael talks a bit about education. He says it's a factor of production that increases productivity, increases industrial competitiveness. And I must say, I find that kind of language much more characteristic of our current neoliberal era than as the basis for an alternative to it. As a public university teacher, I reject the idea that my job is to raise the productive capacity of workers or reduce the overhead costs of American capital. I don't think that's what I'm doing. And I don't think that we will be successful in defending education and other public goods from defunding and austerity on those grounds. I think that we need to defend them on their own substantive merits from a framework outside of their benefits to industrial competitiveness. I don't think we want that kind of education. I don't think we'll win with the case for that kind of education. More fundamentally, the analysis here suggests that the most objectionable features of capitalism stem from it not being capitalist enough. The analysis implies that what we want is more competition. We want more ability to minimize, to seek whatever organization of production will minimize costs. We want to get politics out of markets. It is, I think, and again, perhaps Michael would accept this characteristic. Characterization is to me a sort of Proudhonian position. That the injustice and waste of existing capitalism stem from the failure of prices to accurately track the costs of production. Whereas for Marx, in my reading, it was precisely the pressure to compete on the basis of lower costs that was the source of the injustice and waste of capitalism. So my questions, to wind up here, my questions to Michael would be, are we sure, how confident are we that it's useful to think of financial industrial capitalism as two different systems, or financial and industrial capitalists as two different sets of people? Might it not be more productive to think of them as two aspects of a single system that exist in some sort of complementary relationship to each other, or two moments in the same circuit of capital? Do we really think there are today distinct groups of industrial and financial capitalists? It's a question. Second, and this I think is, I'm very curious about, what are the conditions under which competition to lower costs will actually generate support for public investment, as opposed to simply efforts to force down real wages? If we're talking about, if Disraeli, speaking for the English, industrial capitalist class, the English bourgeoisie in the late 19th century would push for public education spending and so on, what was the political conjuncture that made that the outcome, as opposed to just more efforts at crushing labor and so on? And finally, I would like to ask if we can be a little more precise and fine-grained in our historical story. Is there really a point in the past, if we've got that long list of oppositions at the end of the paper, is there really a point in the past where we could say the economy was on the industrial side in all of those dimensions? Or can we say anything about maybe the different trajectories followed by the different dimensions of financialization? And then I guess I would finally ask about the politics of it. This being an URPE event, presumably many of the people virtually in the room with us have at some time or another saying, stood up and held hands with their neighbor and saying, is there aught we have in common with the greedy parasite? And the question is that just the bankers that we're talking about there, or is it the bosses? And I'll end there.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And I realized I forgot to introduce Josh for those who don't know him yet. Josh Mason is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College of the City University of New York, as he referenced recently, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. So I'll give Michael a chance to respond to the questions that Josh posed. And as he's doing that, other questions can be added to the Q&A. And in a few minutes, I will start asking those to Michael as well.
Well, I love Josh's comments. He said a lot of things that I didn't fill out in my paper because I was talking about a separate set of dynamics. Of course, we're in a mixed economy. I agree with that. I would say that Jeff Bezos is an active rentier. He doesn't really produce the things that Amazon sells, but he's taken control of the marketing process enough to put the booksellers out of business and a lot of other sellers out of business. My point is that finance capitalism and industrial capitalism have different laws of motion. They work together. And as Josh pointed out, of course, they interact with each other very much. And the capitalists, as he pointed out, are indeed concerned about the inheritance tax. And they look at themselves as evolving into rentiers, as trying to create means of production and capitalist enterprises in order to make money through the stock market, through the bond market, through stock options if you're a financial manager. So of course there's an evolution towards monopoly capitalism. Monopolies have become in a way part of the rentier class, and capitalism has become, without quite being aware of it, more of a rentier element than there is a productive element. And in terms of the politics have also been transformed, democratic politics and socialist politics. And I think the big change came after World War I and throughout Europe and America. Once you had private home ownership, rise of ownership, all of a sudden the homeowners became the landlord class. You've just seen in California the fight of voters to oppose taxing rent, because the land's rental value, because that would tax the homeowners. And they don't realize that if you don't tax away the homeowner's value, then the bank, you're going to have to end up paying the same amount of money in interest. But because the state doesn't get the financing, you're going to have basically the homeowners paying higher taxes and a higher interest payment. So I think that absolutely you should look at the economies in terms of mixed economies. Josh spoke so fast, it's hard to for me to follow a lot. I think that the fight by capitalists to lower wages and lower living standards, in a way, was a kind of dialectical a failure on the larger frame of things. And that's because the essence of, in the late 19th century, you had the protectionists and the capitalist advocates of industrial capitalism saying that high wage labor was more productive labor. And American labor was able to undersell labor in other countries because it had high wages, because better fed labor, better educated labor was labor with more leisure, was more productive. That's why you had the working day shortened. The individual capitalists tend to be self-destructive, as you're finding today, a race to the bottom. And so if you put this this industrial capital mixed economy that you have in the United States between industrial and finance capitalism in conflict with say, China, you have industrial capitalism, financialized as it is leading a race to the bottom. And the question is, can a race to the bottom to cut costs really win out in the global economy? Josh is quite right. It can't. Of course, that's neither of us are supporting the idea that you compete by race to the bottom. That's neoliberal economics, and that's China is still fighting against that element of neoliberalism, and that's why it's trying to upgrade, use most of its productivity now to upgrade the quality of its labor even further. In America, they call that, there's a euphemism for the entrepreneurial economy, and it really is just a euphemism for inherited wealth and money that is wealthy families able to educate their kids better, get them into higher universities, and essentially outcompete and make a higher income and inherit wealth. And they all say that this is the result of personal responsibility, blaming the poverty of the economy on personal responsibility. You have America today. We're going into I think, a disaster of economy for 2021. Other countries are able to avoid this disaster. Europe has been able to weather the coronavirus by in Germany paying 80% of the wages to labor. So the question is, in this mixed economy, how do we, I'm trying to untangle the separate dynamics that, as Josh said, are interacting. I think most of the points he made, especially about Thorstein Veblen, absolutely correct. Veblen said that the essence of any city development is to look at it as a real estate development project. And of course, the capitalists support infrastructure in order to increase the value of the real estate. It was the landowners in New York that extended the Second Avenue subway. All of the Second Avenue subway increased values all along the Upper East Side by enough that it could have all been, if it were taxed away as a windfall gains tax, that could have paid for the whole subway extension. Instead, all the gains went to the landlords who backed the city in developing the Second Avenue subway, and the costs were paid by the other transportation riders in the rest and by New York taxpayers. So what I'm trying to do is just separate the strands of the dynamics. Of course, I'm not saying finance capitalism replaced industrial capitalism. Of course, you think of it as a parasite on the industrial base, a financial rentier parasitism on the industrial base, which is essentially how the classical economists looked at it. So I think if I would have had 200 pages, and certainly if Josh's discussion and my discussion go together, I think you'll have a pretty rounded picture of how the economy works.
Thanks, Michael. So I see there are some questions in the Q&A, so I will ask them in the order they have come up. So from Robert McKee, there's a two-part question. So is industrial capitalism good capitalism and finance capitalism bad? And didn't Marx and Engels base their critique of bourgeois economics by attacking those classical economists?
Absolutely right. Of course, that's why Marx is a socialist. Marx wrote about capital, but he didn't say, I want to be here's how to have a more efficient industrial capitalism. He said, here's how to get socialism. Here's what you have to straighten out. What I'm saying is that finance capitalism has taken a form that undercuts and corrodes industrial capitalism, and make the way in which capitalism has been financialized in the West has made it a less successful industrial capitalism than you have in, say, China's economy.
All right, from someone with just the first name Michael/Mike here has a question for this Michael. Baran and Sweezy and the Monopoly Capital School emphasized the growth in waste, which when Harry Magdoff joined Monthly Review and began to collaborate with Sweezy became an explosion in the fire sectors of the economy. But why is that a conflict between industrial and financial capitalists? As G. William Domhoff showed in many, many works on the American ruling class, these two groups interpenetrate each other, right?
Of course, that's what I'm saying. We're in a mixed economy. I never meant to say that these two economies are separate. I'm looking at within the economy, the internal dynamics, the internal contradictions, as Marx would say. The dialectic of industrial capitalism has turned out to take a different, it has not led to socialism as Marx and his contemporaries expected. It's led to something else. And what it's led to is not very pretty. Also, Josh made up the point that industrial capitalism, to be the workshop of the world, what do? You do what Americans do. You support dictators in Latin America. You send out assassination teams to kill the land reformers, to kill the labor reformers in Chile. You, of course, you support dictatorships and feudal totalitarian regimes. That's what America calls democracy. And it is democracy. The dictatorships in Latin America, the military dictatorships, Pinochet, Brazil, Australia, Argentina, are America's idea of democracy for the Americans. That's part of the irony of the whole process.
All right, there was a question for Josh about Amazon from Mona Ali. Said, Josh, regarding your commentary on Amazon, from a Sheikh and Tonak worldview, retail should be separated from productive of capital, industrial capital. So Josh, you typed an answer, but you can share it by. Oh, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I mean, the specific point about Amazon, but I think it's an important general point. They're not just a retailer. Actually, the majority of their profits come from Amazon Web Services. So that's, I find it hard to see that as anything except production. I mean, it's a big part of our means of production in our modern economy are, servers and the architect and the software that runs them, and that's actually the biggest source of profits for Amazon. But I also think, I'm not sure exactly the nuances of the Sheikh and Tonak argument, but it seems to me there's a pretty basic distinction between retail, where the profits just come from a markup, and retail, where you're actually improving the distribution process. And it's very hard for me, if in fact Amazon can actually outcompete other companies on price and put the local booksellers out of business, because they have a lower cost system of getting the books or whatever it is. Obviously now it's not just books, from distributed to the buyers. That's a lowering of social cost, just in the same way that producing food more cheaply would be. I don't see any principal distinction there. And I think and the real point I wanted to make is that the sort of the if you're looking for the peak of the American ruling class, it's people like Jeff Bezos and not passive rentiers.
All right, another question for Michael from David Kotz, who asks, didn't what you call industrial capitalism play a key role in the retrograde transformation of capitalism around 1980? Big productive corporations through the Business Roundtable and other channels demanded the enactment of a program of deregulation, privatization, tax cuts for business, and cuts in social programs. Their aim was to crush trade unions as well as to gain freedom to pursue profit by any means necessary.
Well, the question is, did Thatcherism and Reaganism save industrial capitalism in England and America, or is it its death knell? I think Thatcherism and Reaganism have been a disaster. I think deregulation is a disaster. I think the environmental problems that they've caused are a disaster. I think in England, the vast increase in housing costs, forcing English labor to, if you live in London, work in London, you have to work outside of London and take privatized transportation that is pretty hellish there. I think that all of that's been a disaster. Is that really intelligent industrial capitalism? Well, just try comparing, taking a subway and a train in China or even Japan or other countries. I think you're having England and the United States under their privatization and their financialization as failed industrial capitalism. It certainly is not capitalism leading to socialism. It's leading to something quite different. And it's leading to an economic polarization. Up until 1980, you had wages and living standards rising steadily. in England and America. They've been absolutely steady, slight downward since 1980. All of the growth since 1980 of this privatization and financialization has been for basically the upper 5% of the population. The question is this a successful industrial capitalism? It certainly is not. If we're looking at the laws of motion, it's certainly not a democratization of industrial capitalism as it began at. It's something entirely different. And it was trying to explain that difference that led me to distinguish the financial and the rentier laws of motion from those of that industrial capitalism began with.
If I could just jump in here, I do think there might be one point of disagreement between us or difference of perceptions, because although I certainly think the sort of neoliberal turn of American capitalism has been a disaster for most American people, and it certainly doesn't look like a move towards socialism, I'm not convinced that it's been particularly bad for American capital. I think certainly not relative to Europe. I think where if you were looking for a country, which is a region where capital is really, really struggling, that would be, I think if you were a European wealth owner, you're much more likely to be envious of your American peers than vice versa. I think that in many ways, the American dominance over the global economic system has been kind of reasserted in this period. So I think we need to be very careful of what I sometimes call the sort of liberal theodicy that says that the conditions favorable to capital accumulation are also the conditions favorable for social progress and for meeting human needs. I think there's an argument to be made that the model of sort of rolling back the public sector, rolling back the power of labor, and reasserting the dominance of finance over the management of productive enterprises has in many ways worked out quite well for American capital.
This is exactly what the whole discussion should be about. Yeah.
All right. Wait, I lost my place in the line of questions. Okay. Oh, here we go. Here's a question from Ron Bayman about a possible way of looking at the issue. He says, how about looking at the question as one of equal versus unequal exchange, or seeing surplus value as arising from exploitation of labor and production, or seeing surplus value as increasingly being created, not just allocated by extraction through financial and rentier means? Is unequal exchange the same thing as rentier extraction?
No, it's different because of the unequal exchange has to do with the terms of trade. John Stuart Mill began to discuss this in his 1844, Some Unanswered Questions, when he points out that debt service, the fact that the raw materials producers are subject to control by the World Bank and the IMF, whose doctrine is austerity, vicious class war, vicious war against labor, to keep the raw materials producers poor and under despotic governments and thoroughly in debt, so that the foreign debt of raw materials producers requires them to keep devaluing the currency. When you devalue a currency, what you really devalue is the price of your labor. And that's because there's a common price for raw materials throughout the world. There's a common price of capital goods throughout the world, common price even of credit throughout the world. The one thing that can be devalued when is the price of labor. And so the unequal exchange is a kind of devaluing the labor of debtor countries, mainly the raw materials countries, and that's different from the domestic exploitation of wage labor by capitalists and the overhead that wage labor has to bear from the rentier economy. So we're dealing with different processes here.
If I can, again, just jump in, I think, there is this historical argument that unequal exchange occurs because of the greater market power enjoyed by producers of industrial goods versus of primary products. And this is historically favored. So it's interesting because it's a sort of different association of market power, the market power competition dichotomy with the land versus industry dichotomy. It's the opposite in the sense of the sort of Prebisch type of unequal exchange argument hinges on the notion that there's more market power in industry and relatively less in primary product production. But then we could complicate this story, today, first of all, by the fact that this is no north-south is no longer as defined by industry versus primary products. And also, perhaps, if we're entering a world of greater, material scarcity, at least you could make the argument, maybe the terms of trade could systematically shift back in favor of primary product producers. But I do think that I think it's an interesting way in which these things kind of line up in a sort of different way in that context.
Our next question is about the China-US comparison. Are China and the US really that much different with regards to the interaction between the manufacturing and financial sector? In both countries, the banking sector is highly intertwined with political parties and regulators to ensure a continued return on investment, low default rates by fiscal and monetary policy. Isn't the move to subsidized education and better educated workers in China just reflecting an economy in transition, moving towards a higher position in the supply chain?
There's a total difference, and the difference is because the most important sector that China has taken in is socialized is banking. In America, if you're a corporation and you are insolvent, as is happening to many companies today, the creditors take over. They sell you at auction. The buyers can break you up. They can turn your factory into gentrified real estate. But in China, there are many companies that haven't been able to pay their debt. What does China do? Because the central bank of China is the creditor. China can simply write down the debt. It's easy to keep the industry company in business and functioning if you're the creditor. You write down the debt because the objective of China's government is to keep its industrial sector in motion. It's very hard politically to cancel the debt if you're canceling the debt of a private banking sector, because then you have the private banking sector. Essentially, you've privatized electoral politics in America. The wealthy, the politics is turned over to is financed by the donor class. And you don't have that donor class controlling politics in China. You have the Communist Party controlling politics. And if it decides that, yes, we're the banks and we do control, we have the power to render certain companies insolvent when they can't pay, but we don't want them to be insolvent because they're part of the supply line. And China is still basing its economy on the basis of industrial engineering, not financial engineering. The question is, who controls the banking class that has such power within the government? And that's what makes the difference between China and the United States.
Thanks. The next question is from Paolo Ramazzotti, who asks, do you believe that capitalism would flourish were it not for rentiers? Can't we consider recent financialization as the consequence of the contradictions of manufacturing and of the post-World War II so-called golden age, leading to a shift of money making from manufacturing to finance?
Sure, that's my whole point. I thought that's what I was saying.
All right. A question for both of you from, I hope that I pronounce this correctly, Shailaja Fennell. Might I ask what the speaker and discussant thinks about recent work that is updating the classic work of Hilferding's Finance Capitalism on the value created by cartelization and how this confronts small businesses?
I'll let Josh talk first. I'll have to think of an answer.
I mean, I think there's obviously an affinity between the Hilferding arguments and the current financialization arguments. I mean, there's another aspect to this, which is there's cartelization, but there's also the joint ownership of corporations via index funds and equivalent. This very interesting phenomenon where even if the ultimate owners of financial assets are widely dispersed and include entities like pension funds, insurance companies, there's a sort of middle link in this, which is an index fund, where an enormous number of these ownership claims pass through, so that you can almost imagine an evolution that we're not very far off from, where essentially all of these financial claims are exercised by one or a few giant institutions. So it's almost like the capitalist class pooling its ownership of the economy as a whole and sort of exercising their ownership claims jointly and then divvying them out among themselves. And that in some ways looks very much like Hilferding's description of finance capital. Now, the other side of this is obviously that the actual the actual cartelization or monopolization of the productive activity itself. And there's debates about how much of that the joint ownership actually produces. In other words, if the airlines all are owned by the bulk of their stock is owned by a couple of index funds, do they actually coordinate more in their pricing decisions, or don't they? I think that part is less clear. But I do think there's a natural sort of way in which some of these financialization arguments sort of lead you to take the position of small business, and whether or not you think that's a politically productive place to be, but it's sort of a natural opposition that this kind of thinking leads to, in my opinion.
Well, I knew Josh was going to say what I was going to say, but he said it faster.
Very good. So the next question is from Ivan Velasquez. Question for both of you again. Could you talk about the role of hedge and pension funds on the deindustrialization of developing countries, and what could be done to hinder this process?
I think it's a tragedy that pension funds have been financialized. The whole idea of pension fund capitalism was to give the pretense, the euphemism, the fiction that somehow pensions would end up becoming a co-owner of industry. It's been a disaster because they weren't co-owners. You had the first form of pension funds was stock ownership. This was perfected in Chile under the Pinochet plan developed by Chicago. You would have the workers become stock owners in the industrial shell that they were working for, but the industrial company was part of a conglomerate called a grupo that was caused by the commercial bank that was also owned by the kleptocratic industrialists down there. The workers' contributions would go into the stock ownership of the company, and then the owner would do just what Sam Zell did with Chicago Tribune. The workers' owners would be invested in the corporate stock. Then the conglomerate owner through the bank would lend money to the industrial shell, then all of a sudden leave it bankrupt, wiping out all of the workers' pensions and having transferred all of the real value into the bank and the other conglomerate members. This is how the Russian kleptocrats essentially bankrupt companies. It's modern financial management as taught by the Chicago Business School, and it's been a disaster. As for the pension funds that are invested in stocks, you've had them, the whole idea is that in order to break even, you have to pretend to be able to make 8.5% interest per year. That still is what pension funds in California assume, other pension funds. There's no conceivable way in which they can make this kind of income. And so the pension funds basically are now going insolvent. You've had a huge movement within industry in America to shift from, as I said, from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. Look at the government pension, the public sector pension funds in Chicago, in Illinois, the perfect example, broke. What on earth is going to happen? The idea that you have to pay workers pensions by making money in financial capitalism, whose role is to undercut and destroy the way that you have to make it is for finance capitalism, whose role is to destroy and undercut industrial capitalism, is ultimately self-destructive. Pensions should be paid as they are in Germany and other countries on a pay-as-you-go basis. Pensions should be a public obligation to cycle pensions through the financial system that becomes more and more corrosive of the industrial system. I think is turned out to be a disaster and an internal contradiction for American capitalism.
Yeah, if I could just jump right on that, I think the pensions are a really interesting case because they show you how sort of the dominance of finance can be exercised, or even if you are a creditor, that being a creditor, being an asset owner, can actually be a position of subordination to finance as well as being a debtor. Because these local governments that have shifted towards funded pensions, and I should say I agree completely, the funded pension model is just, it shouldn't exist. But the governments that have shifted to them find themselves being forced to respond much more to financial criteria in making all sorts of employment decisions. Their ability to fund public services now depends on the performance of the market. Their decisions about current payroll depend on the expectations about returns in these funds. And of course, they're also a source of fees and payments to the financial sector from the sponsors of these funds. So it's an interesting case. And the economic logic of it is really unclear, particularly in today's environment, that it's cheaper, even in a very narrow sense, to pre-fund things as opposed to just pay the pension obligations as they come due. Local governments have lots of predictable expenses in the future. We don't have the idea they all have to have a dedicated fund set aside to be managed by Wall Street to pay for them, and it's not clear why pensions are any different. And by doing that, you make yourself much more dependent on the performance of the financial system, much more dependent on the advice of people from the financial industry, and much more vulnerable to whatever happens in the financial system. So it's a really interesting case where you can see that financialization is not, it's not always the power doesn't always run from the creditor to the debtor. It sort of runs from the center of the system to the people on the edges who may formally be in the position of an asset owner or creditor, like in the case of a local government sponsoring a pension fund.
Next question is from Mark Looney to Michael. The bank and corporate bailouts related to the Great Recession of 2007 to 9, followed by the recent pandemic paycheck protection bailouts. Do these developments, plus, as mentioned, tax breaks, represent something new with finance capital dominating economic recovery policy compared to earlier New Deal approaches? Were there better approaches used internationally?
Yes, of course it's something new. The banks should have been let to go bankrupt. Here was a perfect example. Sheila Bair, head of the FDIC, said that Citibank was not only a corrupt bank at the center of the corruption and the junk mortgage crisis, but was also the most incompetent, badly managed bank. It should have been taken over. You could have turned Citibank into a public bank. You could have wiped out the bondholders. I think it's largely in Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries, and the stockholders, and no insured depositor would have lost a penny. You could have taken this and made Citibank the center of a really public spirited bank. That would have been great. Now, instead, you criminalized the financial system. The bailouts put the criminal class in charge, and instead of calling it the fire sector, maybe I should call it the fire sector: finance, insurance, real estate, and crime.
Thank you. David Kotz had a follow-up comment to his earlier question. The point is that the dynamics of capitalism as a whole, including its productive aspect, led to the neoliberal transformation of capitalism. I don't think there was a question, but if you have a comment on that.
What? What? Can you explain? It went too quickly for me to follow.
Okay, so I think this is David Kotz following up on the question about his earlier question about industrial capitalism's key role in the retrograde transformation of capitalism around 1980. So I think he was just following up on your response to that by making the point that it's the interplay of the two, which I think is what you've been saying, right? It's the interplay of the industrial with the finance that led to this neoliberal transformation.
Yes, with the finance coming out on top. Yeah, you said it so quickly, I wasn't sure, but yes, he's quite right.
Yes. Here's a request from Ruth Indek. Please comment on the monthly review idea that the moment of change came after Europe and Japan recovered their industrial capacities after World War II, increasing industrial productive capacity. At the same time, inequality and poverty limited the ability of people to buy products. Industrial markets became saturated, so finance became more attractive, nowhere else to go.
I just don't know what to say about that. The moment of change, I wouldn't call it the moment of change. I just have no comment.
I have a couple things I'd like to say to that. First of all, you hear this idea a lot that, productive capacity was devastated in the war and then it recovered and then there was excess capacity. I don't think that's really right historically. The actual physical destruction of the war was a lot less than people think. Productive capacity recovered very quickly. And in general, the notion that you've sort of got a fixed level of demand and then capacity can overshoot that, in general, the industrial production, it's not, I'm not endorsing Say's law, but in a broad sense, the industrial production creates demand. There is not an independent fixed level of demand. I also think, and this goes back to this notion of the sort of liberal theodicy that I mentioned earlier, I think the notion that inequality has a decisive impact on ultimate demand is frankly overstated by people who would like to think that the stable accumulation of capital has got to require a more just society. I think the reality, certainly in the US, is consumption among the highest incomes has risen a lot. There's actually a lot of consumption demand at the top of the income distribution. There's no logical reason why you can't have an economy based on producing yachts and seventh homes and lots of obsequious domestic service for rich people. It's not a world we want to live in, but it's not a world that is impossible. And of course, there's also demand that comes from investment and demand that comes from public spending on things like the military and so on. So I think the notion that inequality necessarily produces some sort of economic crisis or breakdown and accumulation is one that I think people put really too much faith in.
Marx discussed this a lot when he was arguing against Ricardo's idea that mechanization was going to put labor out of business. This is still being discussed today, and Marx said that in volume 2 of his Theory of Surplus Value, that a permanent crisis for shortage of demand under capitalism, certainly from mechanization, didn't seem likely because the capitalists would spend all of the profits that they made on hiring machine makers. The demand would be for machinery and for more mechanization. And Marx spelled out, followed the whole Department 1, Department 2. It's all in volume 2 and volume 3.
All right, a follow-up question from Ron Bayman, who asked the earlier question about unequal exchange, and he wanted to clarify that he didn't just mean unequal exchange in international trade, but within domestic economies. So I'm going to make an interpretive guess or rephrasing that maybe he means when market power allows for things to trade at a price very different from their value. I hope that's a fair way of restating it, Ron. So does that change anything about the answer? Does that add, are there other things you would want to add to what you said earlier about unequal exchange?
Sure, what he means is rent is the excess of price over intrinsic cost value. That was what classical economics is all about. That was the whole discussion of the 19th century. How do you bring actual prices in line with the actual cost value so that you don't have parasitism, you don't have a rentier class? Well, of course, when you have the stock market price of Google and Amazon and Apple going through the roof as they have for IT, of course you have prices way in excess of the cost of production. That's super profits. And the super profits were, for the classical economists, a form of economic rent. And the idea that under competition, if you break up the monopolies, then you wouldn't have super profits, you'd have a competition. So by unequal exchange, all that means is economic rent as the excess of price over value.
Right, and this again is maybe a little bit of a tension between us, because in my mind, and maybe I'm more in the spirit of what Ron is asking here, the ability of the capitalist to get a profit depends, in fact, on their ability to sell at a price higher than their cost of production. And this, especially as we're talking about a greater proportion of fixed capital, I think this distinction between normal profits and super profits gets harder to maintain, because the greater proportion of your costs that are fixed, the greater the markup you need. Obviously, mainstream economic theory has this notion of declining returns that allows you to get a sort of marginal cost price that still covers all your fixed costs. But we know that's not how it works. And without that, if you don't have declining returns, then the markup and the amount that you need to cover your fixed costs are just two different things. And you're going to need some sufficient market power to generate the markup that will get you but there's no reason, there's no particular economic force that produces inequality there. So you've got to be. And this is, dynamic Schumpeter and Minsky and other people have written about, that you need a high degree of market power and monopoly in order to deliver the profits that then validate the investment in fixed capital using processes. So I'm not as convinced that we can draw a bright line between, let's say, super profits generated by bank-sponsored railroad mergers versus the profits that the whole development of the railroad industry required in order to recoup the investments. I don't see those as two different things. I almost see them as two aspects of the same thing. So in that sense, I'm maybe a little more on where Rod's coming from here, at least.
Yeah, you're describing the Walmart phenomenon. I mean, what Walmart did was really develop an accounting system, to minimize an inventory control system. The inventory control minimized the amount that you had to hold in inventories and gave it an advantage over the others. You're right. Walmart's was a marketing innovation system.
Thanks. All right. Just looking at the time, we have about a little less than 15 minutes left. There are 2 questions currently in the queue. So there would probably be time for 1 or 2 more, depending on how long these take. So just looking ahead at that timing. There's a comment from Mona Ali that you might have a response to. She says, Michael, let's not ignore China's complex financialization strategies, from its development of offshore renminbi markets in Hong Kong with all its anti-democratic outcomes to digital currency and, of course, US dollar accumulation.
I don't understand anything about digital currency. I can't even begin to, it's just way beyond me. No comment. It's like as if you had all your savings in Andy Warhol etchings. Think of digital currencies as Andy Warhol etchings. That's what it is to me.
I mean, Mona, you know more about this stuff than I do, certainly, but I do think from a sort of, the biggest perspective, it just seems true to me that the thing that distinguishes China from a lot of other industrializing or middle-income countries or countries that have attempted to industrialize, one of the big things that distinguishes them is the relative degree of political control they've maintained over the financial system, and their relatively high degree of capital controls they've been able to successfully maintain to limit, financial flows in and out of the country. And my sense is the dollar accumulation is just kind of the side effect of that. If you allowed wealthy Chinese asset owners to buy as many dollar assets as they'd like to, those dollars would go away pretty quickly. So I mean, I'd be interested maybe later talking with you about this, but I agree with Michael on that. It seems like the most salient thing about China is the degree that they've maintained political control of the financial system and kept it oriented towards the needs of development of industry, as opposed to, the desire of private wealth owners for liquidity and the ability to move their funds out of the country.
Thanks. All right, so this is currently the last question in the queue from David Ledbeater. For Michael, I think the real strength of your approach is in retaining the productive-unproductive distinction, with unproductive activities such as in banking and real estate being a deduction from the total production. Why specifically do you think economics became hostile to this distinction? And today, even many progressive economists using it in their analyses of working class conditions and the environment.
Well, the whole attack on the concept of productivity was an attack on the theory that economic rent was unproductive. All this occurred in the late 19th century in America by J.B. Clark. I describe it all in my Killing the Host. Clark said that there was no such thing as unproductive labor, that everybody made income as a result of, by definition, meaning tautology and circular reasoning, by contributing to production. So any person who was wealthy got wealthy by contributing to the productive process. And of course, that's the founding fiction of neoliberal economics. And it's a fiction that Lloyd Blankfein expressed by saying that the partners of his Wall Street investment firm, Goldman Sachs, were the most productive in America because look at how much money they made. Now, if you define as productivity in terms of how much money you make without concern for productivity, well, what the hell? The mafia is the most productive. sector of the economy. It should be in the statistics, but in the 1930s, when there was an attempt to put crime into the national income accounts by Roy Ovid Hall, that was blocked in the sense that crime isn't nice. You can't put that into the statistics. So that now, ever since, you've had GDP statistics of only reporting what's nice. And it's nicest to say that everybody gets their wealth by being productive. There's no such thing as economic parasitism. If you, the objective is to get rich, and by getting rich, you make the whole economy richer. This is Chicago School junk economics. And of course, that's mainstream economics today. So mainstream economics is based on the denial of productivity. And in fact, in 1964, I wanted to write my PhD dissertation on concepts of productive and unproductive labor. And the person who was in charge of that for the National Bureau was the wonderfully named Solomon Fabricant for fabricating. And he said, well, first of all, I want to try to recruit you into the CIA, and gave me a long pro-CIA talk saying, you know, they need people like you. And then he said, the concept of productive labor has been rejected because economics is a constant progress, and if a theory has been rejected, it's because it lost out in the Darwinian survival for existence and is not worth discussing. So the concept of productive and unproductive labor is not worth discussing. And of course, that's just what Bob Heilbronner said at the New School, which is why at that point I thought, I'm going back to Wall Street, where actually, fortunately, all the leading economists are Marxists there, and we can talk about how the economy really works, and not much use staying in academia.
Thanks. There's one more question that has come in. Doesn't the extraordinary market capitalization of Amazon and Google also reflect investors' expectations that these firms operate in natural monopolies and will eventually raise prices to the detriment of consumers? Yes. Isn't it fair to describe a monopoly on critical infrastructure as neo-feudalism?
Yes, obviously. But there's that should be supplemented. 8 trillion. That doesn't explain the stock market value alone. What explained the stock market value is the $8 trillion of bailout of the CARES Act, that the Federal Reserve is now supporting stock market prices. If the stock market really reflected economic activity, if stocks were a reflection of expected profits and expected activity, the stock market would have plunged. And the Republicans and the Democrats said, we can't let the stock market plunge. That's our campaign donors. Hey, they're paying our salaries. Not that we report them as salaries, but we owe everything they pay for our television ads that gets us elected. So the loyalty of the Democrats and the Republicans were not to the voters, but to their campaign contributors. And they said, of course, we're going to support the stock market. Forget labor, forget the voters, forget the economy. It's all about the stock market, as Donald Trump kept saying again and again and again. So the level, it's true that the leadership of the stock market by Amazon and the others is an expectation that they can continue to operate deregulated ways and make super profits or economic rent, but the overall level of the stock market is a function of the capture of the Federal Reserve by the financial interests, by Wall Street, and by capturing the government itself and the central bank and the Treasury, by capturing the government to support stocks and bonds, which are claims on the means of production, rather than actually supporting the means of production itself.
All right. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left, so and no outstanding questions right now. So if you have a few closing thoughts, go ahead and share them. I'll give both of you a chance to do that.
Well, the idea of the law of motion of industrial capitalism is to make profits by producing products. The question is, what is a product? And Josh has pointed out the products are not only physical, they are means of social organization as well. But the aim of finance capitalism is to get economic rent and interest, and mostly to make capital gains on this. And no one before really the 1980s, the focus wasn't on capital gains. People looked at the stock market and the value of stocks and bonds and banks as simply being a capitalization of profits, a capitalization of income at the going rate of interest. Nobody thought that the stock prices and bond prices and bank loans would be decoupled from the whole production process and solvency process of the real economy. All of that has transformed the economy in a way that nobody really anticipated. And the reason that Marx didn't anticipate it was he thought that industrial capitalism would follow logical laws of self-interest, and he didn't think that it could be captured by essentially quite different laws that were not concerned at all about the dynamics and the laws of motion that he were describing.
And I suppose I'll reassert my view that financial claims and the financial industry represent, at the most highest level of abstraction, simply the claims of the capitalist class as a whole. The finance industry is the industry that represents the interests of the capitalist class and ensures that the productive activity of the economy remains subordinate to the needs of capital accumulation. And if financial assets have done extraordinarily well in the past 30 years, I think that reflects in some large part the fact that the real balance of forces between the capitalist class and the rest of us have been extraordinarily favorable for the capitalist class over that period. I think that I'm more skeptical that it represents a distinct financial phenomenon or a sort of fraud. I think that in reality, the flow of profits going both to certain leading firms and to the capitalist class as a whole has been very high, and that the value of the financial assets reflects that. And so my broader position, although I should say I really appreciate having a chance to go back and forth with this with Michael, and I've learned a lot and found it very interesting, but I remain in my previous position that there's not really a clean separation to make between financial capital and industrial capital.
Well, one dimension we haven't discussed is the time frame. The financial time frame is short term. It's hit and run. It's to make a profit. It's short-term gains. I think the average time of most stocks, you know how long they're held? I think the average stock is held for 48 seconds or something like that, because you take all of the average of all the transactions. Industrial capitalism is a long-term time frame because you have to develop a product, you have to invest in research development, you have to put in place a marketing system for all of this. The financial time frame and the capitalist time frame is money to commodities to money. The financial time frame is short, money to money, and if you have a private capital firm taking over a company, they cut back the long-term development because they're into how much are we going to make this year. Just like a politician's time frame is short. For the election, the financial manager's time frame is how much can I increase the stock value this year so that I can make my bonus by pushing up the stock. So I'm not going to reinvest my income in investing in more plant and equipment and research and development. That's long-term. I'm going to use it to pay out as dividends to support the stock price and for stock buybacks to support it. So the whole stock buyback program and a high 93% of corporate income is paid out as stock buybacks and dividends, not for long-term investments. That's not a long-term, that's really short-termism. Does short-termism work out over the long term? We didn't discuss that, but that would be another way of drawing my distinction.
All right, we have just a few seconds left, so I just want to close with thanks to Michael for his wonderful talk and Josh for his challenging commentary, and all of you for your questions. And I hope that we can see each other in person at the next David Gordon Memorial Lecture next January. So thank you, everybody.
Been a nice talk.